Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our breakout panel on better data access through API integrations. Seems like a mouthful. Hope you will find it interesting and useful. This is who we are. My name is Chris Schwartz. I am an implementation expert at LegalServer, which means I help folks come on board with the case management system. With me today are my friends Mallory and George. Mallory, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Chris. I'm Mallory Curran, and I am a consultant. I bring 13 years of experience as a legal services attorney, both in Cleveland, Ohio, and in New York City, to my work. Most recently, I was the supervising attorney for the mental health law project at Mobilization for Justice at what was then MFY Legal Services. And I would consider myself an accidental but enthusiastic legal technologist. Building on something Chris said earlier, I definitely am not a born techie. It's something that has sort of come to me out of necessity and also out of interest. And a lot of what drove me to do this work was thinking like, oh my goodness, there must be a better way to do this. And a lot of times I found that the answer to that question, the better way to do something, is through technology. So for the last 5 years, I've been doing consulting on legal technology as well as medical legal partnership, which was my practice area. And through that also health IT. So really happy to be here today with everybody.
Thank you, Mallory. You're up, George.
Hi, everyone. My name is Georges Clement. I'm one of the co-founders and the executive director at JustFix.nyc. So for those of you that aren't familiar with JustFix.nyc, we are a New York City-based nonprofit building technology for the housing justice movement in New York City and soon to be outside of New York as well. So excited to join you all today.
Cool. That is awesome. Excited to have you folks with us. So this panel is going to explore the use of API to get data to your advocates, to your case handlers, with greater urgency and efficiency than you might currently be able to get. And we're going to do that through looking at a use case, looking at a practical application of application programming interface. But so let's get into the technical term here, which is important to describe and which I'm going to do from what is essentially a layperson's perspective. So what is an API? An API stands for Application Programming Interface. And my semi-layperson's understanding of API is that it is a language that two different programs, or more than two programs, can use to communicate. It's a common language between programs. They can use this to exchange small bits of information and get back other small bits of information. And one of the most ubiquitous uses that I can think of that you might have run across is when you're ordering something online and you put in your address and the system looks at it for a second or two and says, that doesn't look like the right address. Do you mean this address? What's going on in the background there in the flash of it or the blink of an eye is that what you've typed in is being packaged and sent to another program that's authenticating it. And usually in this circumstance, it's the United States Postal Service, which is looking to see if you're putting in a valid address. So that's a very sort of basic example of how APIs are used in the field and where you might have run across them. And again, they're ubiquitous, so there's lots of other cases where you've probably run across them that you don't even know about. So I want to talk a little bit about my experience as a housing attorney, because I think it'll set the scene for what the problem was or what the challenge was, and then we'll talk more about one way where that problem has been mitigated. As a tenant rights advocate, when I would get a case, I would do some research into what the defenses might be, into what the posture of the landlord might be, and whether or not they even had grounds to sue. And I would need to pull in lots of different data points to do this. And when I started practicing in the early 2000s, Every different data point that I would need to pull in would be another email or another internet form that I'd have to fill out, or another office that I would have to visit. So here you see a list of the different records that I would need for a typical case, which could be a deed, a certificate of occupancy, a multiple dwelling registration, the violation history for a property tax bills, and then a map as to where the property is that my client, had an apartment in, and photos of the building to see if there were any defenses based on the status of the building, what the building should be. And to get all of this information, I would potentially have to consult the city registrar's computer system, ACRIS, have to go to the Department of Buildings, might have to contact HPD, might have to send a FOIL request to the Department of Finance, and then I would have to go to Google Maps as well. And so, my docket of information could be overwhelming for what could be a relatively simple case. And if I decided to forego gathering one of those bits of information, I could be making the choice not to advocate as strongly as I could for my client, to not pull in information that I could otherwise use. And this is a time-consuming process, and not every position I was in included the help of a paralegal or of a volunteer attorney or of other attorneys. And when you have a full docket, having to pull in this much information could be extremely burdensome. What happened recently, or what's begun to happen, is that New York City has begun what they call the Open Data Initiative. And you can visit this website yourself at nyc.gov/open data. And this is an initiative, this is a program that New York City started to make a wealth of public data generated by various New York City agencies and other city organizations available for public use. And so this is sort of a central repository of information, which in and of itself is very useful. But the other little tidbit, and you can search by the agency that you're looking for, the category of information that you're looking for. It's a really great website, and I encourage you to check it out just to see what's on there, even if your practice isn't central to New York City. And there's probably some local analog where you are, or one that's developing where you are if you're not in New York City. One of the other bits of information that's important about this is they have made this data available by API call. So your system can give a little bit of information to them, and you can get back some information via API call about a property or about an other matter that you need information on. So I'm not the only one who's kind of was facing down this information. Mallory, I'll turn it over to you to talk a little bit about your experience.
Great, thanks, Chris. So you can go ahead, to the next slide there. So the way that this particular project that we're going to talk about today started was actually a few years ago, where I was having a conversation with an advocate who asked this simple question that turned out to have a super complicated answer. So the question was, can't we just see a flag in LegalServer in the case management system that shows which addresses are DRE or SCRE eligible? And for those who aren't familiar, DRE and SCRE are programs that freeze rent for certain people with disabilities and certain senior citizens who meet a variety of different thresholds and factors. And so it seems like a question like, could I just see as somebody, likely eligible for DRE or SCRE? But as we dove in, it ended up having a much more complicated answer because, everything in New York City is complicated and nothing is simple. So that really led us down that path where we started to dive into the types of information that are available on Open Data NYC. So we started, that slide that Chris had up with all those different types of databases. Led us into thinking like, gosh, how can we pull in that data so that the housing advocates can see those data responses and have them stored in the case. So we approached LegalServer. They certainly underscored our feeling that this actually had a more complicated answer, though it was a simple question. And at the time, they were starting to refine a tool of theirs called the generic API tool. So they worked with us to start refining that tool to sort of better meet our needs. Some of that was New York City specific, but others of it just aligned and could be used by people throughout the state and throughout the country to have more control over the types of requests that you make or the types of information that you might want to share. And we learned that it's not, the data is not always as clean as you want it to be, and the addresses are not always as clean, and that there's not a simple way to pull that data in a structured way, but that we could think about pulling that data into case notes. So we kind of moved forward in fits and starts on this. We didn't have any particular funding to do it, but we all thought it was like pretty cool and interesting. And I'll say that there were several conversations at this conference over the last couple of years that helped refine our thinking about how we might want to proceed. And in particular, a conversation that we had last year with several people who I know are on this call really helped us think, like, how can we both focus on what we're doing and expand our thinking to think a little bit bigger. So just sort of reminding ourselves to think big, but not forget to build a strong foundation. And then also always to be careful, like asking ourselves the question, for those of us who are legal technologists, like, am I the one who thinks this is cool? Or will advocates actually use this? So going back and making sure that we were having conversations with housing advocates about what exactly they would want, so that we were focusing our efforts on things that would be useful for them. And another consultant who I think might be on this call, Laura Bly, who we've worked together on a number of projects, and a colleague of hers from her former organization, Lenox Hill Neighborhood, we're having a conversation. And the housing advocate said, what's at the bottom of this slide, which is like, all I really want is to be able to see what's in Who Owns What for my clients. Like, you want to know what I want? That's what I want. I want to not to have to go over there and enter the address and all of this stuff. So going back to LegalServer and being like, what we really want is what's in Who Owns What, then led us to be like, well, if what we really want is Who Owns What, like how do we work with JustFix and Who Owns What, so that we're not reinventing the wheel, so that we're leveraging resources that are already available in the community. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to George to talk a little bit more about what Who Owns What is, how it came about, and then we'll come back to me and I'll do a demo to show you what we've built out.
Thanks so much, Mallory. So, JustFix.nyc had been doing work with tenants and legal aid attorneys and tenant organizers for a number of years. Maybe 2 or 3 years at that point. And we started to hear a common question from tenant leaders and organizers and lawyers, where there might be a legal case or an organizing action happening in a particular building where they had identified, this is a building where the landlord is problematic, and they were interested in identifying what other buildings a particular landlord or management company was involved with in that neighborhood, in the borough, or across the city. And this was in order to broaden a legal case or to broaden an organizing campaign. And it was historically very difficult to actually identify what other buildings a landlord was associated with. If you've paid rent in New York City, oftentimes you've paid rent to, 10 Main Street LLC. So every single building is technically its own legal entity. And it becomes very difficult, therefore, to actually connect those legal entities to map out an entire portfolio. So that had historically been really difficult. And the secondary question really that was, there are all of these amazing rich data sets out there. But I simply want to see all of those in one place. And so those were really the seeds of what became Who Owns What. And so the process really involved working with these really experienced tenant leaders and organizers and lawyers that had been manually connecting these dots between buildings over the years by downloading spreadsheets or logging into different city agency databases to put together portfolios, by hand, basically. So, I always think of a picture of, an investigative journalist or detective that has, strings and thumbtacks on a wall and a table covered in different papers. And that had been the process. So we weren't actually inventing a new process, but instead digitizing those existing tactics and applying it across the entire city and all of the different data that we could get on all residential buildings across the city. So next slide. So there's really two value propositions with Who Owns What. The first is you can enter in any address in New York City and get an aggregate view of the data for that particular building. The other is, and next slide, we actually make those connections between buildings to map out portfolios. So what you see on the left is sort of a simple diagram of what's going on in the background in order to do that mapping. So we're looking at different data points like the name, the corporate names, the individuals' names, the registered business addresses, and making connections based on those data points. And then we create sort of what you see on the right here, which is a map of all of the properties that are associated across the city. Next slide. So one of the really interesting pieces is that we can now see data and analyze track records across an entire portfolio. So rather than only looking at data for a particular building, we can do something like this in the summary tab where you can see there's 19 buildings and you can look at a data point like the average number of HPD violations or the average number of evictions, something along those lines, which can be really valuable to understand the quality of a landlord across all of their properties. The other piece was we heard some really interesting anecdotes that came from this expertise that had been built up over decades of doing this process manually that we were able to solve for. So one of those sort of hurdles in the past had been that there was evidence of particular landlords that spelled their name in different ways on different documents. So I believe it was actually an attorney from Lenox Hill that brought it up first, and then this was sort of seconded by other organizers and advocates, that there were landlords who, whether this is knowingly or not, had their names spelled in 10 plus different iterations on different registration documents. And so it had made it very difficult to actually see all of their buildings in one place because you had to search all of those different iterations in order to pull all of that together. So we were able to build in that sort of fuzzy matching into fuzzy name matching into the algorithm that then makes those connections. So you see here an example of one of those names where that had become a really significant barrier to researching this particular landlord. Next slide. And you can also do your own analysis with this data. So you can really easily export all of the data in a CSV that could be the sort of aggregate view of all of the buildings in a particular portfolio. So this is a particularly large portfolio with 155 buildings. And so you can quickly download that into the format everyone knows and loves as a way to analyze this data, which is a spreadsheet. So you can also do that quite easily. And I'll sort of wrap things up and say, it was very exciting when we started the conversation with LegalServer because there was such overlap in who was using Who Owns What in their day-to-day, and the opportunity to make it an even more integrated part of their workflow was a very exciting opportunity. And so it's been great to see how that's been used since we set that up and started that partnership.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. Chris and George, please do let me know if my audio goes out. I'm a little concerned that it will. Okay, thank you. So, you know, in short, Who Owns What is awesome. And whatever API calls we were going to do, we're not going to be as awesome as what was in Who Owns What. And so in making that connection and thinking about, okay, if we have all these advocates who have their case management system open in one tab and Who Owns What in another tab, like how do we bring those two things together? So in talking to LegalServer, Jeff Hogue was like, oh, what if we did an iframe? And I was like, what's an iframe? I had never heard of an iframe before. So again, you know, not all of us are like totally up on all of the tech vocab and everything, but you know, quick Google search will fill you in on a lot of pieces of information. So an iframe basically pulls in another information from another website, basically like a picture of that website into another website. So it's an opportunity for us to pull into the case management system a window into Who Owns What. And the API piece of this is that LegalServer is sending the information over to Who Owns What to say, hey, we want to look at the address information for this particular address, so that our advocates don't have to cut and paste the address, go over to Who Owns What and pull it in. So we were able to get that set up, and testing out with Mobilization for Justice and with Lenox Hill Neighborhood House, add that into the intake process for cases as well as the case profile itself. So you can see here, for those of you who use LegalServer, and I know not everybody does, which is one of the reasons I left my little Pica tab up there to have solidarity with others who might not be using LegalServer. But if you do use LegalServer, then this would look very familiar to you, the various steps of the intake process. At Mobilization, we put the information on the type of case page and also on the program questions page. We have it defaulted to closed because we know that not all of the advocates at Mobilization want to look at this data, but some of them do. So if they click yes, then the iframe will open. So you can see this is the Who Owns What page here right in LegalServer. So I didn't need to cut and paste anything. I didn't need to go over to Who Owns What. And I have the same functionality as though I had opened this up in another tab. So I can see all of the information that's really important to me as an advocate as I'm starting to assess defenses, what's going on in this building. Is this a business entity that I recognize, like Westminster Management? It's very recognizable to a lot of people in New York City. It's owned by the Kushner family, so it's become more familiar to other people as well. And then also all these sort of like useful links. If I want to go and view other important information about the case, I'm just clicking straight from LegalServer to head over to see that information. Similarly, it looks very much the same for a case that's already open. We just added another tab here on one of the tab blocks so that we could go in and see that information. And again, if we wanted to click through on other tabs within Who Owns What that George was showing you before, it's possible to do that as well. So, one of the things that was important to us, as I talked about, was making sure that this was working for advocates, but also thinking about dissemination. So we, because of our history in working with Mobilization for Justice and with Lenox Hill, they're not huge organizations, but they have a strong housing practice, a big housing practice. We felt like they were good organizations to start with. But once we got this, and I have to say it's very, very easy to set up. from a LegalServer site administrator perspective. It's not complicated at all. We wanted to get this out to the others in New York City who are using LegalServer as quickly as possible. So, you know, we use a combination of like focus groups with the advocates to get feedback on how it's working for them. Did the setup work okay? We built a little like toolkit instruction sheet, letting the administrators know how to set this up, assuming that they do have the GIS module. It doesn't take long and you don't need a huge amount of expertise in order to be able to do it. We take you through it step by step. And then we also had community conversations. So we did some trainings where we advertised both on the Housing Advocates listserv and on the LegalServer site administrators listserv, so that people would know that this was happening. And we both had LegalServer administrators who were telling their advocates about it, and we were also having advocates telling their LegalServer administrators. So we did get that sort of like cross-pollination to demonstrate for people, show them how easy it was to set up, and then Chris and I hosted some follow-up office hours for people who had questions about how to get this set up and rolling. And then we've continued to have focus groups with the advocates to say, okay, now that you've been using this for a while, what do you like about it? George participated in that as well, so that he could take the feedback to his team to say, okay, could we maybe pull up this particular link for that to a different spot on our website so that it's more accessible for them to make those changes. So I'm going to pause there for a moment. I have a couple of other things to mention about sort of where we think we're headed from there, but I want to see if George or Chris have anything they want to add, or if any questions have come in through the chat.
I think I neglected to mention, please do ask questions in the chat. We're happy to take questions from you folks. So I'm very excited, both as a part of LegalServer, but even more importantly, as a housing advocate, to see something that caused me so much time and resources done in one easy step, doable in one easy step, both from within a great case management system, but also on a great website, Who Owns What. The thing to keep in mind here is the kind of broader application of the concepts that we're talking about today, right? We don't necessarily know what information is useful for your practice. And, you know, we'll talk about this more soon, but you think about this broadly. This is one use case. And the thing that you should take home is that there's open data available, and where there are APIs available, you can build on that information to pull it into wherever it's going to be most useful for you. So I have a couple of questions coming in from chat. Might as well take those now. Does Who Owns What pull data directly from Acris? It does. Do you want to demonstrate, Mallory?
Sure. Yep. So if I go down here to these useful links here on the right-hand side, if I just click there and open up in a new tab, it's going to take me to the information for this particular address. And same with if I want the HPD building profile and so on. Now it's going to take a little longer because we're on Zoom and HPD may be a little slow today.
That's one other thing that I'll highlight is seemingly the API calls to websites like HPD take a lot less long than going to the actual HPD online site. And I'm sure there's a technical reason behind it, but it's just a sort of quality of life improvement there. Okay, some more questions in chat. These are good ones. Is it possible to integrate information from eCourts or from NYCIF? I don't know that any API information is available. Do you, George? From either?
No, so we're not able to pull information from eCourts or NYCIF directly. That would be very interesting. I know, you know, NYCIF is just sort of getting applied to New York City Housing Court right now. So I think there's maybe something to explore there, but not at the present.
There was another question about how much work it takes the legal services organization to get the data to be loaded. from who owns what. I think it means from who owns what to pull it into your LegalServer. And it's a very quick and easy setup. And we have an instruction sheet. So if you email me, and we'll put up our addresses at the end, and I can put it into chat as well. I can send you a copy of the instruction sheet, which we send out on the housing listserv as well as out on the LegalServer listserv.
Great. Well, please continue to ask questions as they come up. Mallory, do you want to move back into the slides on further development?
Sure, that sounds great. So I'm actually going to stay in demo mode here for a minute. So once we got the iframe set up and the data pulling in directly into LegalServer from who owns what, and I will say the data appears in LegalServer, but it is not stored in LegalServer. So there's not structured data coming in. We can't run reports on the data that's in who owns what. So, but who owns what was so awesome, we just needed to get it up and running. We wanted everybody to have it as soon as possible. But then we came back around, had more focus group conversations with the advocates who are starting to use it, and to say, you know, go back to that question of like, am I the legal technologist? Like, am I the one who thinks this is cool, or should we move forward in X, Y, and Z ways? And so one of the pieces of feedback that we got from the advocates is that they really are interested in bringing some of the data in a structured way that could be stored in LegalServer, and more, as importantly, then reported on for a variety of cases, you know, to identify trends and issues over time. So that's a conversation that's ongoing for us. And we then sort of pivoted back to our individual API calls to think about the types of data that's available and what it might look like. So, you know, just from the actions menu, we built a thing where you can request building data. It has you check the address to make sure that it's correct. The reason for that is that the key data point is the borough, block, and lot number, which is like a very important to figure out what address you're talking about in a New York City perspective. We identified 7 types of information that people would be interested in having pulled in. You can see those there. And then on the last page of the API call, these do come in as case notes, but we divided them up by topic. So alternative enforcement program is meaningful to housing advocates in terms of if the landlord is enrolled in this type of program. Certificate of no harassment, it's not eligible, or it's not relevant for this address, but it could be for other ones. It gives us different data pieces about HPD jurisdiction, HPD litigation, which can give you an idea. Like, I pulled up this address because it had a lot of false certification of no lead when I was looking through it. So it gives you kind of a feel for what's going on in the building, other types of things that are relevant. So you can see here that these pieces of data come in and could be added to a field in LegalServer and then reported on. And so we felt like, one, this is helpful for people to have in their case notes if they want to be able to pull that in, but also view it as a stepping stone, a way to help the advocates understand what type of structured data could come in. So we're using that to launch that conversation. And then on the bigger picture, I'm going to stop my share here for a second. If Chris, if you can pull the slides back up. You know, there remains the interest in the DRE and SCREE flags that I mentioned at the beginning, trying to say for any case that comes into a legal services program, like flag it, you know, hey, if there's a person with a disability or an older adult in this household, you should be talking to them about whether they're eligible for this rent freeze based on their disability or their age. There definitely is a lot of interest in that from our advocates. But again, this is a like thinking big, but making sure we're building the appropriate foundation so that the data that's needed to sort of analyze that is coming in. We also talked about doing kind of a building alert, you know, flagging an address as having sort of like red alert. There's a lot of problems with this building, yellow, like caution, there's some things wrong with this building, or like green light, this building is actually pretty good. Is again, once again, not reinventing the wheel, and making sure that as resources exist in our community, we're leveraging those without doing new development And so, for example, the Displacement Alert Project has information it's actually linked to through who owns what, and sort of thinking through how can we, as I say, leverage something that's already there to make it easier to access for advocates without trying to do something that someone else is already doing a good job at. So those are some of the things that we're thinking about moving forward. And I will say, for the types of open data, of course, New York City has a lot. It's a big, huge city. But as we've talked about APIs with different people in different parts of the country, I think people are sometimes really pleasantly surprised about how much data is available for their communities. So for example, thinking about somebody who's from Texas and was like, I don't think I'm going to be able to find anything. And then through the Google search, actually was, as I say, pleasantly surprised about what was available. And of course, it's not limited to housing. There's a lot of other practice areas where we might think about what types of data exist that could be useful to our advocates.
And one of the benefits of coming together in these conferences and keeping in touch on issues like this is that, you know, Mallory and I come from essentially a housing background in New York City. So we think housing, and we know George through being interested in tenant rights advocacy. But there are other areas of the law and there are other bits of data that we don't even know how advocates use out there. And, you know, so this is a call to action to you other folks in New York City, outside of New York City, outside of New York State, you know, become aware, just, and a Google search is enough. Look for the types of open data that are available in your jurisdiction or that are available in your substantive area of practice, and think about what would be helpful to put in front of your advocates with a minimal amount of work. If they're already, you know, in our case, if they're already entering an address for a client into a case management system, then why should they have to do that again to pull in all this data from the, you know, 6 or 8 or 10 websites that I listed off at the beginning? So just become aware of it, and then, you know, talk to the community, talk to us, talk to whoever else is out there about developing a way to pull it into your case management system or to pull it into some other data collection scheme that would be useful for your organization. LegalServer is certainly not the only case management system out there. Again, this is a use case scenario. And then it's not the whole universe of what you can do with this data. And then the other thing I'll say is, what about data that's not available, right? What about the NYSEF data? What about the eCourts data? Well, we need your advocacy. We need folks out there who are saying, make more data available, and who can also look at the other side of the coin, which is, would it be dangerous to make this data available? Will this give a leg up to the folks who we find ourselves on the other side of the bar from, right? Will this, making this data available? Now, in the housing space, landlords have used all kinds of automated methods to generate all kinds of lawsuits against our clients. They certainly go from anywhere from generating non-payment cases automatically to the tenant blacklist, which was a way to gather court information automatically and then basically disseminated amongst the landlord community so they knew who was being litigated against. So there are dangers too, and those are dangers that you're going to be able to identify as an expert in your field. So we need more folks involved. There are dangers to open data, and there are ways that that data that could be used to make our job easier and to help us bridge the justice gaps for our clients, which is the entire theme of what we've been doing here. So I see some more questions in the chat or comments.
And Chris, could I actually share my screen again? And I think
Sure.
I can help respond to Shira, who had a question about whether you can get DHCR, building lookup information. I'm guessing you mean rent registration. So I'm going to share my screen here. So this is the link that Shira put in, and I just wanted to highlight that, let's see, where did I have it? So in JustFix, or in Who Owns What, and this was one of the conversations that we had actually with George as part of the focus group, was if you go in to take action on JustFix, one of the things that you can do is be taken to learn about your rent and order your rent history. So it's going to take you to kind of a simple step to walk through it. I think similar to Shira, to what you were asking about. So one of our conversations was, is there a way to make that link shorter without so many clicks through Who Owns What? But there's not directly available. Oh, and the question is outside of New York City. So I'll turn that over to George, but I think at this time, no.
It's just available. Who Owns What is only applicable and available for New York City right now. Unfortunately, when you get out of New York City, the open data laws are quite different, and the open data availability is quite different. For instance, on the city level, HPD, the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, publishes a good amount of data through the open data portal on the city level. DHCR on the state level doesn't have the same requirements and doesn't really share any kind of open data feed for their data. So rent stabilization data, for instance, has historically been very, very difficult to get directly from DHCR. And so the way that the rent stabilized count is arrived at and displayed on Who Owns What is actually through Department of Finance, New York City records instead. So sort of a roundabout way of getting to that. But the big piece is, the open data law applies to New York City rather than at the state level.
And that's an opportunity, right? Because we have policies around the country in surprising places, as Mallory was mentioning in Texas. And a lot of those open data laws were proposed by agencies who are interested in protecting consumers and protecting tenants and protecting tax-paying citizens, various lobby groups. Your part of your legal services experience is pushing for greater rights for the constituencies that you represent. So in addition to identifying bits of data that would be useful to you that are already available, what we'd really like to see is figuring out what data isn't available, which should be available, without damaging the folks who we represent. Because once it's made available, then these implementations are possible, right? And this is just one implementation. This is just one case management system. There's nothing stopping you from creating an API call. Maybe that doesn't go to a case management system, but that goes to some sort of informational document that could be sent to your constituents to give them an idea of what their rights are, or what information is out there on their property, on their taxes, on whatever. So do folks have any other questions for us?
Or I would say also, Chris, like ideas, thoughts about how you would use this in your own communities or your own practice areas, different from what we've talked about today.
Absolutely. Well, this is our contact info, and we do want you to be in touch with us about ideas that you have, or if you're interested in seeing more of the way that something looks inside LegalServer, contact Mallory or me or both of us. If you're interested in Who Owns What and maybe implementation with a different case management system or a different scheme, contact George. Reach out to George and let JustFix know what your needs are, what are out there. We're looking for ways to use this now that there's a case use out there, to make lives easier for our advocates, but ultimately to make things more just and equitable for the marginalized communities that we serve.
Another one of the ideas that had come up that we haven't investigated yet, but a question was, is there a way to see if an adverse party corporation had a valid registration with the Department of State, for example, the New York State Department of State. And so there may be other things like that. I can see other sort of consumer types of cases that could benefit from this type of project as well.
Okay, well, thank you folks for coming. We're wrapping up about 5 minutes early. I can hang out if anyone has any questions that they don't want to ask while we're recording, but you know, last call for anything that you want to make part of the record, part of the written record. Otherwise, thank you very much for coming, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you all so
George.
much. And feel free to reach out to me directly with any questions or ideas. No idea is too crazy either.
Some ideas might be too crazy for me, but feel free to reach out anyway. Thank you, George. Thank you, Mallory. Oh, we've got something in chat here.
That's just me.
Oh, great. Okay. All right, Anna, I think you can cut it. And like I said, I'll hang out for a couple more minutes.